Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's a huge privilege to be chairing the latest webinar in the Neurodivergence series being hosted by Garden Court Chambers. This evening, we're going to be talking about neurodivergent children in the justice system. This event is being live streamed and it's being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and the link and slides will be distributed to all attendees. If you've got any questions, and we do want this to be an interactive webinar, please place them in the Q&A box and we'll be able to answer those at the end of the webinar. And we are aiming this evening to finish by 6:30. So this evening we're talking about neurodivergent children in the justice system. And the reason we're having this discussion is because there is a mounting body of evidence that children who with no neurodivergence are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. But we also want to explore how neurodivergence impacts children in other areas of the justice system. And we have got a very impressive panel of all women speakers to discuss about this very important topic. So we're going to be talking about why there is a high prevalence of neurodivergence amongst children in contact with the justice system, or who may have other reasons to come into contact with the legal process. We're going to hear from experts in their field, but I'm also really delighted that we've been able to draw together a panel of speakers who also have lived experience both of neurodivergence, but also care experience, because there is a huge correlation between children who have care experience and children and then adults who also have neurodivergence. We're going to talk about why that is and how that might impact access to justice. And I hope we'll leave you this evening with some really practical suggestions about how you, if you are a lawyer or somebody supporting a child who is accessing the legal system, some practical advice about how you might best support those children. So my name is Kate Aubrey-Johnson, and I am a barrister here at Garden Court Chambers. And I have convened this panel with my colleague, Jennifer Twite. We have with us this evening, Lucy Barnes, Dr. Rhiannon Lewis, Aika Stephenson, and Ravi Mahey, and we'll be joined shortly by Amanda Weston KC. So our first speaker this evening is going to be Dr. Rhiannon Lewis, and she's a consultant clinical psychologist. And she has been working in the NHS for more than 20 years across different settings, including prisons, forensic hospitals, and in the community. She has experience of leading the implementation of trauma-informed care in youth custody, and currently works as clinical lead for the South East London Vanguard programme, which aims to improve mental health support for marginalised young people who are at risk of community violence and exploitation. I couldn't think of anybody better to start off our discussion this evening to really explore why it is that there's such high numbers of children with neurodivergence who are coming into contact with the criminal justice system. So we'll start with Rhiannon.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kate, and thank you for having me on the panel today. I also work as an independent psychologist, providing expert witness reports across majority kind of youth courts. And previous to my current setting, I was working in Feltham young offenders for a number of years. So I'm really kind of unfortunately have a lot of experience of witnessing children coming into the custody setting, and then their neurodivergence or additional needs only being identified at that point because they've fallen through the gaps in services. So I kind of wanted to speak to the experience of those young people today. I'm also here as a neurodivergent person. I have a diagnosis of dyspraxia, which was only identified later in life, and I'm also a care experienced person. So it's also a subject that's kind of really close to my heart as well. I have prepared a couple of slides. I haven't gone into kind of huge amounts of depth. I didn't want to overwhelm people with lots of references today, but it's just some discussion points, I think, to kind of really highlight some of the multiple complex and overlapping risks that young people with neurodivergence come up against in their lives that can often lead them into the justice system. So I'll just share my screen now. Hopefully it will go okay. I think it, well, bear with me a moment. I think it's going to try and take you to my email inbox, which I don't think everyone needs to see. So let's just try again. So we are thinking about neurodivergent children in the justice system. I just wanted to start by thinking about what we know about neurodivergence and how that has changed over the years. I think there used to be a view that things like autism and ADHD were these kind of very separate conditions that existed in their very separate boxes. Now in the field, we recognise that neurodivergence is really kind of an overlapping cluster of experiences, differences and symptoms that young people and adults who have neurodivergence may have some of in each of these clusters. And we are learning more and more that actually if you are diagnosed with one neurodivergence, the likelihood of you having another or a set of experiences in another of these clusters is actually very high. So the best practice recommendation is if you're assessing for a neurodivergent diagnosis, actually you should be assessing across all of these clusters or kind of sets of experiences. Unfortunately, we know that doesn't match how community paediatric teams or CAM services actually work. What happens in reality is that young people get placed on a waiting list, for example, for ADHD, and they have that assessment. And then if someone later down the line starts to think, actually, maybe there's something else going on here, maybe this young person is struggling with social communication needs, they end up on another waiting list for an ASD or autism assessment. And that is, we really need to acknowledge that our system is not really set up right from the point of identification to work with what we really know about neurodivergence now. There are some settings in which that best practice is happening, and I'm really proud that actually Feltham Young Offenders is an example of that when young people come into that service, we're looking at neurodivergence across the piece and trying to really think of young people's needs in a holistic sense. I think it's also really important to acknowledge, and I'm sorry that the writing in the slide does not come out very well, that actually, although there are kind of real difficulties and challenges that face neurodiverse young people, including contact with the justice system and kind of higher co-occurrence of low self-esteem, anxiety difficulties and mood difficulties, actually people with neurodivergence can have a lot of strengths. They can be very creative, they have to be really persistent in getting over the barriers that already exist for them. They can be very creative, original and determined. And also neurodivergence doesn't necessarily, although there is a large co-occurrence, doesn't necessarily overlap with intellectual impairment. What we often see is a spiky profile that people will have real strengths and then they'll have real areas of need. So actually you can have kind of a real co-occurrence of kind of special abilities as well for some young people. Probably, unfortunately, less likely for the young people who come into contact with justice systems. But neurodiverse people are not a homogenous group. We're a very large and diverse group, and actually some of us have got strengths that have really been things that have led us into different professions or creative arenas as well. So I've just kind of chosen to put a bit of a spotlight about ADHD and then autism and some of the kind of co-occurring risk areas in these two groups. So I think most people at this point will be really aware that adults with ADHD are really overrepresented in prisons. I think 24% is probably a kind of a very low estimate, and so are young people. So in this study, which was by Alexandra Lewis and colleagues, no relation, they found that 43% in 14-year-olds in custody would have met criteria for ADHD. And when we're talking about young people with ADHD, the risk starts at a really early age. Young people with attention difficulties and hyperactivity difficulties are 100 times more likely to be excluded from school than young people without these needs. And that's a really staggering statistic. And we know that exclusion from school is actually the single biggest risk factor in later becoming involved in the criminal justice system. And increasingly, I think we understand that even when those young people are placed in alternative provisions, those alternative provisions actually become targets for criminal gangs and criminal exploitation. We also know that young people with ADHD, they're likely to kind of start that risky behaviour earlier than other young people, and unfortunately it will kind of probably persist for longer. And that if young people are coming from backgrounds where perhaps there are additional barriers to access to services, whether that's a stigma in the community about accessing CAMHS or mental health services, or whether it's actually that services are not accessible or able to meet the needs of different communities, there are already those kind of the multiple barriers to get needs identified. Then when you do get needs identified and you maybe have an EHCP in place, actually schools are really overburdened and can't often provide the additional support that is recommended by those educational plans. We also know that young people with ADHD have got high co-occurring rates of traumatic brain injury, partly because they're probably children who are more likely to get themselves into different scrapes and difficult situations. There's a high later correlation with ADHD and addiction in adult services, and we know that is an additional risk for becoming involved in associated offending. And then when young people with ADHD enter the justice system, we know that actually there's real considerations around kind of the process of being able to give a statement and give instruction and just sit in the courtroom. So kind of lots of additional needs that make the whole process a lot more challenging. I have to say, anecdotally, I was probably on the side of being sceptical of medicating children for ADHD before I worked in Feltham, but having seen children with ADHD really struggle with being in a cell and then getting multiple negative adjudications because they can't control their behaviour, it really made me think differently about the challenge that we're presenting young people and the environments that they're expected to cope in, and how we support them to do that with very limited resources. Okay, I'm aware of time, so I'll try and be brief. And then just putting a spotlight on young people with autism. What we know is that prevalence is probably a bit lower than young people with ADHD only, but if you think actually that they're probably more co-occurring than we understand, it's probably quite a modest estimation, and studies really vary, and they vary like across UK and US samples, and they vary according to the way the research has taken place, but probably up to around 15% of young people in custody are thought to be autistic. Often that's identified when young people are entering the justice system. But kind of if we think about social communication a bit more broader than autism only, estimates from different studies kind of say that between probably 60 to 90% of young people in the criminal justice system have some form of speech, language and communication difficulty. We also know that young people and adults with autism, because of how they might present behaviourally in very challenging or pressurised situations, unfortunately disproportionately affected by police violence. And young people with autism have real difficulty coping in the custody environment. It's a very loud environment, it's very unpredictable, it's very stressful. It's much more likely that they will end up with more negative adjudications in that setting. We know that, as with ADHD, but a little, again, more of a conservative estimate, young people with autism are 3 times more likely to be suspended, and that autism is less likely to be identified in non-white young people. So again, that's something about how services are set up to meet needs of different communities. And just, I guess, with the knowledge that we have that autism is probably not identified in girls as well as it is identified in boys, I think that the way we ask questions or the way we assess isn't always targeted at groups where there's less pre-existing knowledge. I think also anecdotally, something that I found in my clinical practice is that when a young person's special interest might be something that's very non-typical, not pro-social and risk related. So if a young person has a special interest in gangs, and all the different gangs in London and types of knives, that might not be picked up in an autism assessment. People get very focused on the risk and they don't acknowledge that actually this might be a form of a special interest. And I will, frequently come across this narrative that, they do have these traits, but they don't have these. And then you say, well, ask this young person about all the different gangs and postcodes in London and then tell me that they don't have a special interest. And it really kind of opens people's minds about what do we mean when we say kind of restricted and repetitive behaviours, because we certainly see a lot of restrictive and repetitive behaviours in young people who are in these kind of very risky situations. Unfortunately, it just doesn't meet the stereotype of what we think of as an autistic person. So those are my talking points. I won't take up any more time. I did just pop in a couple of resources. I know that lots of people are already aware of the 20 principles of questioning from the Advocacy for Vulnerable People and Children, but I think it's a great resource. And the National Autistic Society also has a focused report on the experiences of autistic young people in the justice system. I will stop sharing there.
Yeah, and that was fascinating and fantastic. And you took us through a huge amount of really important information that has really even enlightened me, who I thought knew quite a lot about the issue. So thank you so much. We're now going to turn to Lucy Barnes. Lucy will shortly commence pupillage as part of her training to be a barrister at East Anglian Chambers, and we're very lucky to have her here this evening before she's consumed by that new role. She's also a TEDx speaker. She joins us here to talk about, in part, her care experience and that perspective that gives her, having been placed in foster care at 13. She's also neurodivergent and advocates for the care experience community as a keynote speaker. She's interested in the relationship between young people and care experience, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, adverse childhood experiences, and neurodivergence. So she's a hugely talented person to bring her unique expertise to this discussion. And thank you very much, Lucy, for joining us. And we'll turn to you now.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was a really lovely introduction. I'm going to try and share my slides before I start introducing myself without them. Let me see if it works. Fingers crossed it does. Hope preferably first time. That would be great. Can everybody see from the beginning? Can everybody see my slides? Great, fantastic. Okay, so good evening, everybody. I won't repeat anything that Kate said, but I am Lucy Barnes, and I am in particular interested in care experience, being care experience myself. So I grew up in a family of dysfunction to domestic abuse and neglect. I grew up on a council estate where unfortunately there is not many opportunities, if any opportunities. So that was really difficult, and it led to me being kicked out of my home and being legally homeless at 13. And at that point, I was placed into care, where I stayed for 3 years until unfortunately I got kicked out of care, and didn't receive any support after my 16th birthday. So it's quite a peculiar but difficult story, but also at the same time it's got me to where I am. So I think that's pretty brilliant. But it also gives me a different perspective on the law. It gives me a different perspective on care experience young people in the law, and also on trauma. So I have a particular passionate interest in trauma, particularly trauma-informed legal practices to bring to England and Wales, hopefully. And I was trained most recently by the Scottish Law Society in trauma-informed law, which is a course completely relevant for legal professionals, and was really, really helpful understanding the science of trauma and bringing that to my legal practice, which I'm excited for in October. So given that my passionate interests in care experience and neurodivergence, that's what I'll be speaking about largely today, but also how care experience impacts adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and intersects with trauma, as I think it's really important as legal professionals that we do understand both, because otherwise we're only understanding half of the picture. And I'll also move on to explaining the relationship between adverse childhood experience and neurodivergence, and then the practical implications for lawyers. And I'm going to try and address this question of what would I have wanted from a lawyer when I was a child or a young person, and also hopefully if you have any questions to ask me on that and you've got care experience clients yourself, please do ask me, because I can't speak on behalf of everyone in the community, but I am extremely proud to be part of the care experience community, and I want to help lawyers understand the complexities involved. So that's a bit about me. Moving on to the double discrimination, as I phrase it, although can intersect with even more characteristics, but being care experienced and neurodivergent. So from 2020 Department of Education statistics, we know that looked after children are almost 4 times more likely to have a special educational need than all children. Looked after children are almost 9 times more likely to have an education, health and care plan than all children. And even probably more shocking than that is in 2019, 55.9% of looked after children had a special educational need, compared to 46% of children in need and 14.9% of all children. So it's really important when we think about care experience and neurodivergence to see how those two aspects of our personalities and our lives and our experience really intersect with each other, and create probably more difficulties in relation to our involvement in the justice system, whether that's family or crime. Moving on then to care experience, young people and trauma, because it's really important to understand. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a bizarre stigma attached to being care experienced that also involves something, with us being wrong, that we're troubled, or some sort of difficulties that led us into that. That's actually statistically inaccurate. What we do know is 63% of looked after children were looked after due to abuse or neglect, so for reasons completely outside of their control. And in addition to that, they're more likely to become from deprivation, so like me, from council estates, or be from lone parent families, also like me, or in larger households. And we also know that 8 in 10 children were living in a household that was deprived, 51% in a socially rented household. So the overlapping of class and of social origin are particularly important when discussing care experienced young people, and also of race. So Black and mixed children accounted for a higher percentage of all children, so 9% and 7% respectively entering care. So we really do have to consider how our care experience intersects with other aspects of our personalities and other aspects of our experience. And in particular, in relation to adverse childhood experiences, which is coined from the CDC Kaiser ACE study in 1995 to 1997, which followed approximately 17,000 participants, and found essentially 10 types of adverse child experience in this little box that I've got for you there, that impact children's developing brains, and if they have 4 or more, they found in these studies of any of these adverse childhood experiences, they are far more likely to experience adverse life outcomes, like more likely to die prematurely, sadly, heartbreakingly in fact, and more likely to be diagnosed with mental illness. So it's really important that we understand adverse childhood experiences, and especially in relation to the care experience community, because given the statistics of 63% of us being looked after due to abuse or neglect, the prevalence of trauma in relation to us is quite high. So it's really, really important to be mindful of ACEs. And then also, as I'll go on to explain, how care experience, ACEs and neurodivergence all intersect. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but the way that ACEs and trauma and care experience and neurodivergence intersect is still being studied quite a lot. And there's various different people that talk about, and various different psychologists that talk about the difficulties when assessing whether it's ACEs or care experience or neurodivergence, or both, really, because people with intellectual disabilities are more vulnerable to experience traumatic events, but also sometimes the symptoms of neurodivergence are also similar to the symptoms of ACEs, which is how Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's work came about. So I put her TED talk there, How Childhood Trauma Affects Health Across a Lifetime. But interestingly, what she said is she had so many young people coming to her office, and the parents are wanting a diagnosis of ADHD so that they could understand. And what Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris found is that these children seem to score so highly on the ACE checklist, and she wasn't sure whether treatment for ADHD was appropriate, or whether actually they needed to be treated for trauma in addition or in conjunction with. So it's really, really important when we consider the needs of the care experience community, trauma and neurodiversity, in that it can be both, but both require different treatments. And as a result of that, if we're only seeing half of the picture, then we're only doing half of the justice for young people. So we really need to start understanding trauma, particularly in relation to the justice system. And then I put a study there, double jeopardy, which is said, I won't go into it too much here because I'm conscious of time, but it's a really interesting study that talks about how neurodivergence and ACEs both jointly challenge the stress system, and as a result of that, the interaction with the criminal justice system could be particularly problematic, because you've got a double instance of the nervous system becoming threatened, and how people behave in that scenario is particularly difficult. So that's an overview of trauma, care experience and neurodivergence, but also the impact for lawyers. So I'm going to try and tackle this from how I would have liked to have been treated. Definitely adopting a trauma-informed practice, which I think is something that we should be working towards as legal professionals, but also as a child, I think giving children dignity and respect is super important. But above all else, safety. Safety is the antidote to trauma, and making children feel like they are believed, understood and heard is super important. And empowering them. It was a social worker that first, just something small, a social worker said to me, you know, you speak really articulately, Lucy. And that was one of the only nice comments I'd ever received in my life. So it really doesn't take that much to really empower us from the care experience community, providing that compliment is genuine, because we're like sniffer dogs and we can suss people out because our intuitions are very sharp, because we've had to detect who's in a good mood, who's in a bad mood. It's a survival mechanism. But it's important to empower young people and to make them believe in themselves, because there is a skill set and a unique strength in every single care experience young person that's waiting to be found. So why couldn't it be found by lawyers? Why couldn't it be us that supports them, makes them feel safe, and also makes them feel seen and like they could be the next generation of lawyers? So that concludes my talk. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was fascinating, and a huge breadth of knowledge that you have acquired with a unique perspective. So thank you so much for sharing that and giving us that insight into the likely challenges that the children who come into contact with the justice system, but in other parts of accessing legal advice, may be facing. So we are next going to turn appropriately to Ravi Mahey. I apologise if I've mispronounced your name, Ravi, who is going to talk to us from her specialist area in children law. She's a solicitor. She's a member of the Law Society's Children Panel and has extensive experience of representing neurodivergent children in legal proceedings. She advocates for reform within the justice system and the workplace. Ravi herself was diagnosed as neurodivergent 4 years ago and has personal experience of navigating the assessment process for children. So now Ravi's going to talk to us about neurodivergence in the context of family law and family and cases involving children. So perhaps, Lucy, you can stop sharing your slides and we'll turn to Ravi.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I've been working in children law for about predominantly children law for about 15 years, but in family law now for over 22 years. So basically since qualification. And I just want to step back from one of the points you made when we started, and I think it's on the flyer as well, is how we've got to a point where suddenly we're needing to talk about neurodiversity. And where was this 10 years ago and 20 years ago? And I want to step back and just kind of reflect on my own journey into this, if you like. I've been representing children as a panel solicitor for over 10 years. And so I've had a lot of, and I considered myself to be quite informed on neurodiversity. I thought that I was doing a really good job. I thought, right, you know, I've read up a lot about it. I know people with autism and ADHD. In the back of my mind, I always knew I was different. I was quirky. You know, everyone used to call me scatty and different. So I knew that there was something there. And it didn't help that 10 years ago, my sister started working in a psychiatric hospital. And then she was convinced that I had ADHD. So it was always there. So my diagnosis came about 4 years ago, but it was always there. So I'm working with these families and children thinking, I know a lot about this, but I wasn't even scraping the surface. And 4 years into a diagnosis with 2 bookshelves in my living room, with books on ADHD and neurodiversity and autism, I still don't know enough. I'm still finding and coming across people with different experiences and aspects and different varieties, if you like, of the condition, if that makes sense. And so this idea that neurodivergency is black and white really needs to go out the window. I have not met any person who's autistic who's the same as the person next to them who's autistic. I don't know anyone with ADHD who has the exact same presentation that I have, and I probably never will meet that person. They're all so unique and so individual, and the combination of the traits, they manifest in so many different ways, because let's add in personality and let's add in your environment. So I think I was practicing with a textbook approach. I think I was a textbook solicitor, thinking I'm doing a really good job. I really know a lot about this, but it was very textbook. And I think, I can't speak statistically, but I think a lot of practitioners who work with children and young people in either the criminal system or the family justice system have probably got a textbook approach. I found that people who have a personal experience are always more informed and you know, by virtue of them having that experience, have that better understanding. And so I think going back to how we are and why we are here today, I think what's happened is we've got a better understanding. We're starting to see it more clearly with a different lens. And we're starting to realize that it's not black and white. These aren't textbook conditions. ADHD is not about boys who are hyperactive and can't sit still. I was hyperactive. I was extremely hyperactive. I probably spent more time outside of a classroom at secondary school than inside the classroom, because I couldn't stop talking and I wouldn't stop fidgeting. Even though I was bright and articulate and I was doing well, I just couldn't sit still. But no one would have thought that there was anything wrong. I was just, you know, a chatterbox. That's what all my school reports said. She was a chatterbox. So I think what we now have more information. We have now a better understanding. And I think I don't think that there's a higher prevalence of neurodivergence in the community. I really don't see that. I think it's more a case of we're better informed and we better understand it. So when my understanding is that the criminal justice system is probably a step ahead of us in the family justice system, in that you've got proper toolkits, you've got proper mechanisms to look at young people especially, or any adults coming into the system and looking at these issues. I feel in the family justice system, a lot of navigating around that is left to social workers and children's guardians, because they are the social work professionals who are committed to look to the welfare of the children and look at what their needs are and what the issues are. Now, just going back to Lucy's point, by the time I get a case or I'm working with a guardian on a case, we've hit that crisis point where we've now got potentially maybe diagnosed, maybe undiagnosed neurodivergence within the child or the parent, but now we've got to deal with the trauma. So we've missed the opportunity. We're now dealing with the aftermath, if you like. We've gone past diagnosing, recognizing, supporting any early interventions. We've gone past that. And that's why when you're in the system, dealing with neurodiversity is so much more complex, because like Dr. Lewis said, you can't just medicate a child, because you've got to think about what the underlying trauma is. I've got personal experience of medication. Now, some of them I really struggled with. One medication I took and I developed Tourette's, I developed tics. So, you know, these medications, they're so, it's not that there's a right medication for any one person. Very often it's a case of trialing different medications, and that was my journey. And a lot of them had side effects. So I agree with Dr. Lewis. Medication is the last resort. And what we find in this system, what I'm finding with the family justice system, is there isn't any provision to provide care in the way that Lucy and Dr. Lewis say needs to be put in. So there's no trauma intervention processes for children. So kids like Lucy, that we lose them in the system. So we'll diagnose them, we'll get a psychological assessment, we'll do this work, we'll say this is what the child needs, but the therapy never comes in. The interventions, the support, it's not there because the system hasn't got the capacity to deal with that. So I get to the end of care proceedings where I've got all this information about a child, and I know the reality is they're not going to get even 10 to 20% of the support that they need because the system doesn't work for them. So we're having to navigate a system that isn't really fit for purpose. So there's that aspect in terms of identifying, working with children, the fact that the system is, you know, it's not really fit for purpose. But then you've got to then work out, how do you work with children in the system? Where's our toolkit to work with children who are autistic or have ADHD? And there isn't one. And I know this because I'm working it out for myself. So I've got to a position where I went to see a young boy in foster care last week, and he's 14 years old and he's autistic. And he said to me, I don't like contact. I find it, you know, really challenging. And I thought, oh, why? Why don't you like contact? He said, because the contact supervisor's literally standing next to me, like she's here, and I can't cope with it. And it really dysregulates me. I can't cope with it. And I said, well, why does she stand so close to you? Oh, because she's got to make a note. It's supervised contact. So she has to stand right in between me and my dad in case my dad says something to me. And I sat back and I thought, he's got a diagnosis. He's got an EHC plan. How is it that the contact supervisor doesn't know she's working with a neurodivergent child and how has she not how has she not been told to understand his sensory needs and how to navigate that within contact? So she's made contact traumatic for him. He found it really difficult. He's very upset by it. And so there are so many different layers within the family justice system. We're not just talking about the courts. We're not just talking about how we assess children. We're not just talking about how we interact with them and take instructions from them, how they are supported in court. It's much deeper than that. It affects every aspect of their lives, and we're just one dimension in it. And so when I was thinking about what I was going to say today, which I never do, I can't prepare for talks because my ADHD does not let me, because I go off on a tangent, which is probably what I'm doing today, and I will. But what I was thinking was, coming into this, I was reflecting on, I've been talking about neurodiversity for about 4 years now, and probably 2.5 years quite openly. So attending seminars, doing talks. But I don't think that there's a mechanism to address all the different issues, because when I do a talk, it's always curated to a particular topic. So I'm either, with resolution, I'm doing a talk on how to support your staff force who are neurodivergent, which is a really important topic, but that's a separate standalone topic. Today, we're covering quite a lot of different topics, but in fact, we could probably spend at least an hour or two on each topic. And even then, we'd still be scratching the surface in terms of the information sharing and what we could tell you. And so it's about realizing that there are so many different areas in which practitioners, people like you, Kate, need, and Lucy and Dr. Lewis, you need to kind of work collaboratively, but kind of go off and start these different streams. So we're really capturing all these different areas and all these different aspects of the justice system to make sure we're supporting and we're working to everyone. So, you know, in the workplace for us as lawyers, working with children, working with adults. I work for a prison charity called Not Beyond Redemption, and we've come across so many women in the last few years who we've, you know, with having a better understanding about neurodiversity, we're realizing that they are diagnosed whilst in prison, but they're serving sentences and being diagnosed. And then at that point, like we've referred to earlier, we're dealing with trauma and a diagnosis, and it's kind of balancing the two. So I've gone off on a tangent. I probably can't even remember what I was talking about, but what I'm trying to say is there is a lot that I could probably say, but I think I'm going to shut up now and let you carry on.
Yes, no, Ravi, that's fascinating, and thank you for illuminating the specific challenges that that you're facing in the family justice context. And I think beforehand, when we were talking about this issue, it's not just the children who may have neurodiverse conditions, but it may also be their parents, and how that may impact their ability to parent, and how well the family justice system is set up to offer them support and training in terms of thinking about their parenting style through the lens of neurodiversity. But now we still have two more speakers, and I'm conscious that we are already creeping closer to the end of the time that we have this afternoon. So I'm going to turn now to Aika Stephenson, who is co-founder and legal director of Just for Kids Law. She founded Just for Kids Law with Shawneen Lamb in 2006, and she is a solicitor and youth justice expert with experience of representing children in criminal proceedings, and particularly those with special educational needs. She has been pioneering in so many aspects of her career, but she since 2017 she's led the organisation, the Just for Kids Law criminal work, when Just for Kids Law became one of the first organisations, charities, to be awarded a legal aid contract. And in 2018 she was named Criminal Defence Lawyer of the Year, having previously been awarded Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year award. And we're going to turn to Aika, and I'm going to ask Aika some specific questions about how she adapts her representation of children in the justice system who are neurodiverse. So perhaps, Aika, we've heard about how there is a high prevalence of neurodivergence amongst children who come into the criminal justice system, and some of the factors. So there was a report by the Children's Commission in 2012. Nobody made the connection. It isn't a coincidence that these children have neurodivergence. It's often that factor that causes them to come into conflict with the law. But can you talk to us perhaps maybe about a case where you've had to adapt your communication style to meet the needs of a child who is neurodiverse?
Yeah, I think I've got a cold, so excuse my blocked up nose, everybody. But I mean, when you're representing children, you need to do that all the time, and I think that it's you know what everyone said is really important, that no neurodiverse child is the same. So I think with most clients, I like to ask them what they find difficult, and you know what they're most worried about. That's often where I kind of start a conversation with the child about a case. And it depends on where I am, because obviously when you start in the police station, that can be really difficult. You've got a young person who's got to make lots of decisions about what to do, as to whether they're going to comment in interview, the information you can give it, lots of things to consider, like disclosure. It's just not the way that we conduct police stations is not set up for children, let alone neurodiverse children. So yeah, you have to be able to be a bit more innovative and adapt. And so I will think about how I can break down the caution, whether I have to write that out in a flow chart, whether I have to use different colours, pictures. physically acting things out in the room, the presence of appropriate adults in the room, whether that can be particularly difficult or triggering for a young person. Yeah, so I think you just have to be prepared to adapt to whatever the situation is. And then when I mean, it's much easier once you've had an assessment, but obviously you're doing a lot of the work without having had that assessment initially. And so, you know, once a young person is coming to the office, we get to understand how they like to travel to the office, what is the best time of day for them to come, fidget toys, snacks, you know, all of these different considerations, so that when they come to the office, they can engage with that process. And sometimes they just don't come to the office. We meet them elsewhere, or we meet them at home. So I think you've got to be able to be flexible, and sort of meet the needs of that child.
Thank you. And you touched upon, when you first meet them at the police station, not necessarily having any assessments or reports. How often do you have your clients assessed by an expert?
Prior to the police station, or
No,
in criminal proceedings?
In criminal proceedings.
Nearly always. Nearly always. I think the legal aid agency are fed up with our requests for prior authority, because you know, there's very few children that you can really say don't require an assessment before you get some, you know, before you represent them in criminal proceedings.
That's really helpful, I think, for our audience to hear that. We've already heard from Rhiannon that between 60 and 70, or even 70 to 90% of children are likely to have communication needs. So there has to be a presumption that we need an expert opinion on what their communication needs, and whether there are any underlying neurodivergence, whether there is any underlying neurodivergence. In fact, when that report in 2012, there was also evidence that 90% of children weren't diagnosed before coming into contact with the justice system. Was there anything else that you wanted to share in terms of tips with the audience? Because we still have Amanda to join us. So given that you have a cold, I can turn to our next speaker, but you may have some burning things that you'd like to share with us.
I think it's there are lots of resources out there. So the Advocates Gateway has toolkits, also Youth Justice Legal Centre, recent report that you were involved in, Kate, Dare to Care, and also the National Autistic Society has got a guide for professionals, for police officers and professionals. And so I think probably, you know, get some awareness. Just start by asking the question, what do you find difficult, and what makes you feel worried? And I think that, yeah, that's the best place to start. I'm conscious that Amanda should have some time.
Thank you very much. We'll also share in the chat a case that was taken by one of our colleagues, the case of Sisonjo, which was a child who was 14, who was originally convicted of murder, but he had undiagnosed ADHD and ASD, and after a long fought battle, and the Court of Appeal overturned his conviction, and he was eventually acquitted at the Old Bailey after 30 minutes. And that really reminds us all of the importance of getting these diagnoses early on, understanding neurodivergence, and it can make an important difference to outcomes for children. So finally, Amanda, thank you so much for your patience. We turn to Amanda Weston KC. She's one of our leading Silks and Chambers. It's a huge privilege to introduce her. Amongst many things that she does, she co-authored the Judicial Review Practical Guide published by LexisNexis. She's also on the A panel of Preferred Counsel for the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She's got a huge breadth of knowledge, which stretches from asylum, human rights, but also gender and sexuality cases, complex political and religious cases, and appeals for children and vulnerable adults. So Amanda, in the few minutes remaining, will you be able to share with us some tips on how you support children with neurodivergence who come into contact with the legal system.
Thanks very much, Kate. So I've actually just come charging back from a care case I'm in sort of in the middle of week 1, where the 3 parties have got intermediaries. And so I'm feeling suspiciously upbeat about how things can work. I mean, you know, wheels could still come off, but I think that certainly in the family jurisdiction, the culture of making adjustments for individuals who need they need adjustments in order to access the process is definitely improving, and that's in both formal and informal ways. So there are sort of procedure rules, and there's quite a lot of case law on the importance of participation directions and ground rules and what have you. But I think increasingly there's a more granular understanding that the need support doesn't start or end with a diagnosis. So what's important, I think, is that certainly in the family jurisdiction, there's an increasing understanding that participation is about 2 things, really. The participation directions are about 2 things. 1, best evidence. So you're supporting the witness to give their best evidence, and you're also ensuring that they can engage in the process fairly. So it's about assisting the court to do its job effectively and fairly and to do justice, but also Article 6, fair hearing rights, just to sort of put it in shorthand terms. So what that means, if you sort of turn it on its head, park the diagnosis, if you look at it from the prism of those 2 objectives, then your question isn't what diagnosis do you have, but more what obstacles are there to achieving those 2 things. So how do you experience the court, and what prevents you from giving your best evidence for you, not your diagnosis? And just sort of to reiterate a little bit from the sort of tail end of Ravi, one of the important things that we used to the sort of medication of neurodivergence, and it's to an extent it's unhelpful, because that sort of medicalization is very much about accessing and diagnosis, and that emphasis is very much about accessing funding for whatever support you need. But courts, that's not what courts are about, so a completely different approach is necessary. So it matters not really whether the foundational problems are poor coping strategies, complex PTSD, emerging unstable personality disorder, or whatever the sort of medicalized titles are. The real key questions are, when you're in the situation, what is it that stops you from participating? What are the practical issues around being able to respond, to be able to cope with the environment, all those sort of more practical things? Obviously, specialist input can help on some aspects, but I think that what's really important about community court reports and the other intermediary reports is that they don't focus on the diagnosis, they focus on the practical problems. And so in a sense, it's unfortunate that the sort of 2 steps that have sort of become practice is to firstly get your diagnosis and then go to community court. What should happen is, because we're all under, certainly in the family courts, we're all under a duty to identify vulnerable individuals, and it doesn't really matter what their vulnerability is if it prevents them from accessing the process and it prevents the court from achieving their best evidence. That and the sort of siloing of expertise is another thing, that if you just go straight to the problems, to the obstacles, and what the remediation should be, rather than getting hung up on the diagnoses, then help can be a lot more effective. And I know that we want to have some time for questions, so I'm happy to end there.
Oh, Amanda, thank you so much. We are drawing to the end of this webinar, but I do want to just very quickly, if I can, touch upon some of the questions in the chat. There was a question about whether you'll get the slides. Yes, they'll be shared. There was a question about whether education healthcare plans should be supported in custody. The theory is yes, and I've given an answer in the chat. If that is practicable. But the question from Amina is, has the justice system identified the gap in identifying neurodiverse people and worked towards anything to prevent mishandlings of justice being carried out? I don't think so sufficiently. And I think the practical advice that Aika has given this evening is that we've got to make sure that we screen as lawyers for neurodivergence, because it may have both an impact, as Amanda has described, on access to justice and how you may adapt court proceedings so that that not only the young child can receive a fair trial, but they can follow proceedings and they can give their best evidence, but also that the jury doesn't view their evidence as a neurotypical person, but as a person who has their perception of the world based on expert evidence. So then we have a question from Jonah, or Jonna, apologies for any mispronunciation, where there is a tendency for lawyers to go, no, I don't think the person is neurodivergent. What's the best way to get them to take it seriously? What is the best way to question bad medical evidence about neurodivergence by a doctor who doesn't understand it? Does anybody want to come in and answer that? Perhaps Rhiannon, you might want to respond to that.
Yeah, in terms of the second point, I think I guess one of the bugbears that I have as working as an independent expert is that often I will see other reports written by people who actually, and I might get in trouble with some colleagues here, who actually don't have a specialism in either developmental trauma, working with young people, or neurodivergence, and are assessing a teenager as if they're an adult. And I really think we need to get past this practice. I think there should be specific competencies about working with young people in the justice system. It is a specialism, it's not an add-on. I guess all you can do is try and work with someone who very specifically does have that expertise to counter what you think might be inappropriate assessments being used. Like, I've seen lots of reports with adult assessments being used on children. It's just not appropriate. But it's really difficult to challenge when the person has come with that proviso of being an expert.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. And the following question was, do you ever use intermediaries to facilitate communication? Perhaps Aika, you can answer that from a criminal perspective.
It's very, very hard to get funding for an intermediary to for the purpose of giving instructions, which is why we've got to develop our knowledge in these areas ourselves. And you know, everyone that's representing children and neurodiverse children should take up the training. You know, you're gonna have to drive that yourself, and learning and it's trauma-informed practice. I think it's really important. And actually, like, the things that small changes that you can make will go a long way, and it's not really that hard.
But we've also heard about how the environment of formal court proceedings can be very stressful and very difficult to cope with, particularly for all court users, but particularly for neurodivergent children. So do you have experience of using intermediaries during trials?
Yes, always, and we would always ask for the child to actually be supported by an intermediary throughout the trial, rather than just in giving evidence. But also just being a bit more imaginative. Actually, if a child says to you they actually don't think they can cope with being in the courtroom, then we've had numerous occasions where we've made applications for a child not to be in court for the hearing of evidence, which is you know, fairly unique from a lawyer's perspective, but really important if it reduces the trauma for that child and actually enables them to be able to give evidence. There are you know, you can ask for anything in a special measures application if you believe it will improve your client's ability to give evidence. And I think we just need to be a bit more brave about doing that.
Thank you. And Amanda told us earlier about the case she's currently in, which involves intermediaries. So we know that they're being used in a family justice setting. And finally, we have a question. Oh, actually, we've got more, but I hadn't scrolled down, so we're not going to get to the rest. But finally, as a parent of a teen with ADHD and autism, any tips on how to best keep our children out of the criminal justice system? Is it early intervention? Would anybody like to jump in? Maybe Rhiannon, you'll be best placed to answer that.
I don't know if I am best placed to answer that. I work mostly with children in the justice system. I think prevention, early intervention, making sure that children have like good pro-social activities, goals, motivations, role models, all those things help. And of course we can, in fact, I was discussing this with our team earlier, when you work solely in this profession with this group, you can forget actually there's lots and lots of neurodivergent children out there thriving, and so kind of evidence of that on the panel today. You know, but it can become very difficult when actually most of the time you're encountering people who've got in really, really difficult situations. Also really helpful to know that it's not usually just neurodivergence when we meet children in the justice system, and Lucy's spoken to that today. There's usually lots of other adversities and obstacles that have contributed to where they are and their journey.
Thank you so much. Amanda.
Sorry, could I just plug on the 15th of May 2024, we're going to, myself and Dexter Dias are doing a neurodivergence in the justice system sort of hands-on witness handling session, with lots of case law and references that you can use to force on your courts if in that situation. So that's remote on the 15th of May. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. There are more questions in the chat, but I won't have time to get to them. Other events coming up, 29th of March, we've got Access to Justice for Deaf Communities. 5th of March, International Women's Day, in conversation with Madeleine Rees, OBE, Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And on the 6th of March, we've got another International Women's Day webinar, Women Climate Defenders. Thank you so much for all our panelists for joining us. What we've seen is that this is a hugely important topic with so much to discuss, and we've had a chance to have a whistle-stop tour across a wide range of issues. So thank you all for sharing your expertise and knowledge, and I'm sure everybody watching this webinar is hugely grateful for your time this evening and your expertise. So thank you for all of the attendees who've joined us. We always appreciate your feedback, so please do, if you're watching online, take the time to fill out the feedback form, and we will be sending out a link to the recording and the slides. So finally, from Garden Court Chambers this evening and our Neurodivergent series, thank you very much indeed.